This week is going to be a review of week 6 of the NFL action, going over most of the models over at the site, going over what we got right, what we got wrong, talking through some things that maybe should have been a little bit more obvious to a couple different people, and going over some things that were a little bit annoying to look back at in retrospect. Normally, what I do on these review streams is I'll go over my own lineups, and I'll also go over my GPP lineups, my cash lineups, and then I will also review anywhere between 3 to 5 community lineups from the community over at the site. But this week, I think I'm going to focus mostly on what the rest of the field did. Go through the results database, since it's something that I tried to show you guys last week, so that you could review your own process against the pros and against people who are playing with a bunch of money each week. Usually you want to learn from people who have plenty on the line. So I wanted to go through a little bit of the results database over on RotoGrinder so that we could talk through a little bit of the things that a lot of the pros did. I will also go through my own lineups. I think if I can go back and fetch them while we're in the middle of doing all of this, but I wanted to focus more on the field because this was a pretty unique week in terms of what actually happened, right? Like there were a million different ways to go and a million different kind of pivots that you could make to a whole bunch of different positions. And there were a lot of positions and players that ended up getting pretty unlucky. And there were a couple others that got very lucky. And I think that a lot of the time what happens is in an NFL slate or in a general DFS slate, what we're going to see is there's going to be players that end up doing well. There's going to be players that end up hitting somewhere in their median, like the vast majority are going to hit somewhere in their median range of outcomes. And then there's going to be some players that have floor games, right? So, like, if you take a running back that averages somewhere around 20 carries arbitrarily, and they average somewhere around 1 fantasy point per touch, then you would expect their median to be somewhere around 20 fantasy points, pending matchup or any other circumstantial stuff that's going on. If they have a good game, maybe they score 30 fantasy points, maybe they score 28 fantasy points, something like that. That's what you would expect a good game to be. If they have a bad game, maybe they score somewhere around 8 fantasy points or 9 fantasy points. Maybe they had a bunch of rushing yards, but no receptions and no touchdowns, ending up with like 75 rushing yards and maybe 1 reception for 2 yards or something, but no touchdowns. Where they got basically their 20 touches, they just had a really, really bad outing in terms of efficiency. So that would be a bad game. You can look at wide receivers where their median expectation is something like, 23 fantasy points or something for a top end wide receiver. They have a really good game and they end up putting up 40 fantasy points. Think somebody like Julio Jones or something like that, who has median expectation around the 20s, and ends up putting up a massive fantasy score because he has 2 touchdowns on 170 yards receiving. That would be a good game for him. A bad game would be something like 7 fantasy points or something, where he has, 3 catches for 40 yards and then ends up getting turf toe and has to leave the game. There are both ups and downs there. But generally what you expect from a player is that they are going to hit somewhere around their median. That running back that's projected for 20 fantasy points hits somewhere between like 15 and 25. The wide receiver hits somewhere between 15 and 28 or something like that if their median projection is 21 or 22. This week, however, it seemed like there were a lot of players that didn't really hit near their medians. A lot of them hit their floors, or a lot of them hit their ceilings. There really wasn't a lot of in between. And when that happens, it makes it feel a lot worse to be on the pivots that ended up getting their floor games, their bad outcomes, their 6, 7, 8 fantasy point outcomes, when there are other players that end up hitting their top outcomes, the 30, 35 fantasy point outcomes. So when there are less median expectations hit, when there are less medians hit from players, then it feels worse when the other players do exceptionally well. Obviously, one example of this that everybody has been talking about is Alexander Madison versus Derrick Henry. and Derrick Henry ended up hitting his ceiling. He ended up hitting about the best game that he could possibly have. It was something like 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Um, and Alexander Madison ended up having, I think, 6 fantasy points or something, 4 fantasy points. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he got kicked out of game script early and ended up being relegated to nothing. They ended up using the 2 backups behind him. He was filling in for Dalvin Cook, so he was already a backup into an elevated role. But that is a situation where like both of those running backs were projected for somewhere around 24 fantasy points off the top of my head, and one of them ended up having a ceiling game and one ended up having a floor game. And the other thing is multiple running backs in that range ended up having really bad games, and Derrick Henry ended up having a very good game. So that made it so that there were a lot of people who went to the extremes and said, oh, well, Derrick Henry was a good or a bad play based on this or that or whatever, when in reality, like all of those running backs between about 6.9K and 7,600 were the exact same play, all things considered. Like their median outcomes were pretty much the same. I think Aaron Jones actually had the best projection on the slate, for me at least, in terms of running backs. He had the best projection on the slate. So when you look at things more objectively and you don't look at things from a results oriented standpoint, and you say, okay, well, the median outcomes for these players were all very similar. Just multiple of them hit a standard deviation below their median outcome. And then there was like one running back that ended up doing exceptionally well within that range. People want to focus a lot more on the results rather than the process of what led you to those running backs in general, and what led you to projecting running backs the way that you did. Nobody in their right mind is projecting Derrick Henry for 10 fantasy points more than Mike Davis in week 6. Like, nobody is making it so that Derrick Henry is projected for 35 fantasy points and Alexander Madison is projected for 15. That just doesn't make any sense. And if somebody's projecting that way, they don't know how to project things. So I just want to talk a little bit about that really quick, and about expectations of players and the projections that you build out for players. I just think that it's really important to understand that median outcomes are that exactly. When you think of a bell curve, the median outcome is here, obviously, at the very top. And then you have these tail ends that happen on either side, where these outcomes on either side, the 5% outcomes, happen much, much less likely than median outcomes. So I think that it was just one of those situations where a lot of people felt burned, and people felt like, oh, well, I could have very easily pivoted to Derrick Henry. Like I had the money, I spent it on Mike Davis, but I could have had Derrick Henry. I could have had him instead of Alexander Madison. And it's like, yeah, but you lost the coin flip. Like this wasn't a situation of like one of them was projected significantly higher than the other one. This isn't a situation where like Julio Jones is projected for 23 and I don't know, Terry McLaurin is projected for 14 or something like that, and Terry McLaurin goes off for 40, and Julio Jones ends up going off for, or no, other way. Julio Jones goes off for 40, and Terry McLaurin goes for like 12. Like it's not that situation. Like Julio Jones was obviously projected higher. He obviously had a better outcome. He had a better range of outcomes. Like he was a better play. He was much more expensive. So I just wanted to like note on that stuff. But anyway, Tribe, we back. Yes, we are indeed. Hopefully my camera actually makes it all the way through this. I am in the process of buying a new camera and mic so that I can be like an actual streamer guy. I want to focus more on podcast and video content over the next year. So yeah, hopefully get the new mic and the new camera here pretty soon. Tried Showdown first time, took it down with a Niner stack and Woods, but Showdown is lame. I don't know, man. Showdown, like, I don't know, almost binking a Showdown slate like last week or something like that. Showdown's fun as long as you're just like kind of having fun with it. Like you shouldn't put in a whole bunch of money into a Showdown slate and just kind of expect the circumstances that you are hoping happen. Showdowns are a good lotto ticket, but they're not something you should be throwing a whole bunch of money at. What's up, franchise? How you doing, dude? Any interest or Scott Juju's plays next week? I don't know. I literally haven't even looked at the slate. I don't even know who plays next week yet. Usually Tuesdays are my day off. This week, obviously, because my camera died yesterday while I was doing the stream, I have to do the stream today. And because League of Legends is down in Colorado, I don't have anything better to do. So I'm doing this today to recap last week. I don't have any info on next week yet. I haven't looked at pricing. I don't even know who plays each other yet. But in regards to Juju Smith-Schuster, I think he's not very good at football right now. Like, I think that maybe he'll probably be a good wide receiver at some point in the next couple of years, but I think he's pretty bad right now. Like, he can't get open in man coverage. He doesn't know how to open up the field when he is running routes for other wide receivers. People always tell me, oh, well, he's a good blocker and like he's a nice guy. And it's like, I don't give a shit about that. I don't think that he's really a very good wide receiver right now. So in terms of Juju next week, yeah, he'll be low owned. He's probably a pretty decent GPP play. But I don't think he's very good at football right now. So I don't know. Maybe he'll get there. The Watson, Fuller, Cooks, Fells stack paid off again and was able to afford a lot. Yeah, it was. And I was on Houston, but I was on Houston as a way to leverage Derrick Henry in the exact same way that I told people to leverage Alexander Mattison with the Atlanta stack last week, which worked out beautifully. I was stacking up Houston so that I could leverage Derrick Henry. And it was working great until he had a 95-yard touchdown, and then that led to another touchdown in OT, and it's like, it is what it is. So, yeah, I really liked Houston last week. They were one of my 3 stacks. I ended up last week on a Houston stack, a Patriots stack, and a Baltimore stack. I'm going to go find my lineups real quick. Has. One sec, bros. Why? There we go. Or not. Whatever. I'll find it eventually. Hold on. Let's go to DraftKings. Because whatever. What do we got here? Oh. Yeah, there it is. All right. So, yeah. I had this Houston stack, which was Deshaun Watson with Will Fuller and Brendan Cooks. I brought it back with A.J. Brown. I ended up pairing it with Alexander Mattison, Philip Lindsay, and another secondary correlation stack between Mike Gesicki and Jameson Crowder with the Vikings defense. Very obviously, this did not work out super great. I was doing okay, all things considered. Like, Alexander Mattison failing is like, it is what it is. I would have had 100% exposure to him across my 3 lineups again next week. I wouldn't have cared. Philip Lindsay, I thought was a really good play at 4,300. There was no touchdowns scored in that game between Denver and New England, which was obviously an aberration and not something that is going to happen very often. Ended up with a Viking stack to go with Alexander Mattison and against the Atlanta. Like, I kind of thought that people were going to be taking some Atlanta players, and I didn't mind having a Vikings defense that was really, really cheap. And then I paired together Mike Gesicki and Jameson Crowder as a secondary correlation. Mike Gesicki got literally 0 receptions. He only had 2 targets. The backup tight end caught a touchdown. Again, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it's like you have these players that have really, really bad floor games, and there were very few actual median outcomes that were found. And it was really easy to land on a lot of floor games. I had a Baltimore stack that was Lamar Jackson with Marquise Brown, brought it back with Travis Fulgham. I had Alexander Mattison and Philip Lindsay again. This one, I had a secondary correlation of Robbie Anderson and Allen Robinson. And then I had a one-off of Eric Ebron, who ended up being like the highest 4x%, I think, in the sheets. So I didn't mind having him He was about as cheap of a tight end as I felt like taking. I knew that I didn't want to drop down to the very cheap tight ends because that's where a lot of people were going to be going. And I just knew consciously that I did not want to punt tight end because I knew that people would be punting it this week. Again, I paired it with the Vikings defense. I think I had 100% Vikings defense. But again, with this one, like a lot of floor outcomes, like floor outcome, floor outcome, floor outcome, floor outcome. Like all of pretty much the worst outcomes that could happen from these players ended up happening. And that just, it is what it is. And then I also had a Patriots and Denver stack. So I had Cam Newton with N'Keal Harry, brought it back with Jerry Jeudy, ended up going with a secondary correlation of G.J. Chark and T.J. Hawkinson. And then I had 3 running backs in this one: Alexander Mattison, Mike Davis, and Myles Gaskin. Myles Gaskin ended up being my top scoring position player outside of my quarterback, and he only scored 16.6 fantasy points. But it is what it is. Like this game, in terms of having a low total, didn't really scare me off because I know that even if New England only scores 24 real life points and scores 3 touchdowns, like Cam Newton probably had a hand in all 3 of them. I had N'Keal Harry as somebody who was getting plenty of red zone targets, and he should have been somebody who they looked to in the end zone, but New England didn't score any touchdowns, like at all. So it is what it is. And then Jerry Jeudy was a pretty obvious choice for Denver. And I stacked up chalk around this one consciously. Like I knew that all 3 of these players would be chalk because of my stack being really, really low owned. I knew that Cam Newton, N'Keal Harry, and Jerry Jeudy would be nothing owned. I wanted to surround them with a lot of chalk. I actually thought that DJ Chark and TJ Hawkinson would be a lot more popular than they were. And they ended up not being very popular at all, which was surprising. But I really wanted to have like less than 5% ownership between these 3 players and then surround it with mostly chalk at running back in my secondary correlation, which of course did not work out very well. But I mean, you make the conscious play of trying to balance out the leverage that you have against the chalk that is necessary to win GPPs. And this lineup, I think, is a pretty good example of doing just that, where I was trying to make sure that I had a lot of chalk in these players to balance out my Patriot stack. I kind of did a similar thing here. Like, I honestly thought that Robbie Anderson and Allen Robinson would be a little bit higher owned since when, who was it, Curtis Samuel got ruled out. I kind of thought that Robbie Anderson's ownership would jump a bit. But he didn't, and it is what it is. Like, I'll take these ownerships on these players that I thought were in a good spot a lot of different times. Did I have any Burton? I went Fells mainly. No, I actively faded Burton. I thought that it was weird that people were on like Burton and Irv Smith, and I understand why they were on those players. There's just no reliable chalk on this slate, and people were just scrambling to find some source of value. Like Philip Lindsay was a good source of value. People were on like Irv Smith Jr. and Anthony Fursker and Trey Burton, like these cheap tight ends, and they all just crushed. And it's so funny that people got there on those. I thought that was a really bad decision that the field made this week in terms of punting tight end. I understand why it happened, but I was actively trying to avoid it. How and what made Blender set 50 groups, and how can I make great groups? That's like that's a pretty broad question. I don't think that I can really answer it in full here, but like I'm going to be MMEing this week because a lot of people have been talking about MME in the community, and I think that it would be worthwhile for me to like jump in and kind of show you guys how I plan to attack it. I haven't MME'd in a long time, like literally 2 years, but I figure I'll jump in and I'll give it a shot just so that I can kind of play around with you guys and set some exposures and show you guys how I would approach MME with modern day optimizers. How were people on first gear before the Jonnu injury even happened? Well, because he actually wasn't terrible the week before, right? So bring up the opportunity search tool, which is on the site. You guys already know that. I'm not going to spell his name right the first time. First gear. Oh yeah, hold on. There he is. Furkser. There you go. Yeah, I mean, last week he wasn't terrible in terms of like the weeks leading up. He did have 5 targets the week before with no Court Davis and with all the COVID restraints on the Titans. He did end up having 5 targets. He actually ended up having 60% of the red zone targets in week 5. He only had 4.9 fantasy points, but 1.63 fantasy points per touch. Like if it's so funny that you can like take all of these cheap tight ends. Uh, Trey Burton and Irv Jr. So like if you look at these three tight ends, like you don't actually want to roster any of them. You really don't, right? Like Irv Smith Jr. got 4 targets in week 5. Whatever, dude. I don't care about 4 targets. If he gets 4 targets and he catches 3 of them with a 2.6 fantasy points per touch, then he scores 8 fantasy points. I don't give a shit. Trey Burton, averaging less than 2 fantasy points per touch, but getting 6 targets. Like if he catches all 6 of those and gets a touchdown, he gets 18 fantasy points. If he catches 4 of those and doesn't get a touchdown, like he scores less than 8 fantasy points. I'm gonna fade that a million times. Anthony Furski, or Anthony Fursker, 5 targets, 3 red zone targets, 3.8 yards per target, less than 2 fantasy points per touch. Again, like 5 targets is not something that I really care that much about. That most weeks this is not going to win you GPP, and it's so funny that everybody ended up on these cheap tight ends and it ended up paying for them because I never would have gone here. Like I will actively fade these cheap tight ends that are super touchdown reliant most weeks. Trey Burton ended up getting there on a wildcat rushing touchdown where if he doesn't get that, like the first play he had like a 15-yard touchdown or something like that. I was like, okay, that's annoying. But then he got the wildcat rushing touchdown. I'm like, all right, fuck the field, man. That's so annoying. Um, but like when you look at these things, these aren't players that you actively want to roster when they're chalk. You absolutely do not want to roster Irv Smith Jr. when he's only getting 4 targets on a good week. Like you absolutely do not want to roster 23% on Trey Burton, who's only getting 6 targets and is less than 2 fantasy points per touch. Like you don't care about these guys. That's not what you want to roster. And people were just scrambling for value. So it kind of turned into this week where I knew that I wanted to pay up at tight end. I wanted Mike Gesicki. I wanted TJ Hawkinson. I wanted these more expensive guys. I wanted Mark Andrews. Like I wanted these expensive tight ends because I wanted to avoid these guys who are only 2,500. The dude who's 3,100 and projected for 8 fantasy points. Like these are my actual tight end projections from week 6. And you can see such a massive gap between the expensive ones and the ones that people were going after. And like I'm fine fading that forever. Like these ownerships, I'm fine fading that in any slate, period. Yeah, franchise, you can go look at his video. Hold on. Uh, I know he has a video up on like his recap. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you can literally go look at his recap video of like how he set things up and like what he wanted to do. Like that's a good video to go watch. All right. Do you mainly pay down for TE given how often they all bust just to save money? Elsewhere, rarely ran Kelsey or Kittle. No, I mean, I usually want to use a tight end with my stack. So, like, if you look at the lineups that I built, like, you can see that Mike Gesicki, I used him as a correlation play with Jameson Crowder. In this one, I had a one off of Eric Ebron, but like I said, when you look at my projections, like Eric Ebron was the cheapest that I was really willing to go. Like he had a really good 4x percentage. It was slightly less than Trey Burton, but he was projected for 11 fantasy points. He was 4,100. I was fine with going here, especially if it meant getting away from Trey Burton. And then on this one, like I had TJ Hawkinson and DJ Chark in a secondary correlation. Like I'm almost always wanting to correlate my tight end because it is so touchdown dependent. What I want to do is I want to try to set up my tight end so that if that game environment ends up being one that scores plenty of points, that I take advantage of it. Usually, if I have Lamar Jackson, I want to go with Mark Andrews. Normally, if I have Patrick Mahomes, I want to go with Travis Kelsey. If for any godforsaken reason I end up stacking the 49ers, like I'm going to want to have Kittle. But most of the time, I want to take a tight end that is correlated with the rest of my lineup or with the secondary lineup. This one specifically, Hawkinson was correlated with DJ Chark. This secondary correlation as a mini game stack. This one, Gesicki was correlated with Jameson Crowder, mini game stack. So I would rather do it that way rather than punt my tight end or pay up for a one-off tight end. Really, for the most part, I don't want to use one-offs at all this NFL season because it's not optimal anymore. Like it's not maximizing what you can be doing for your lineups. Thomas seemed like a good cheap option given the QB change. Thought maybe Allen would lean on the TE. Um, it's hard to make that guess. Like you can go back into the opportunity search tool, go Logan Thomas. I mean, Kyle Allen played week 5. And I think, didn't he play week 4? No, he played week 5. And like, Logan Thomas just hasn't been jack shit for weeks, man. It was pretty hard for me to go to Logan Thomas after everything that he has kind of been through in terms of like just not being good and that offense not being good. Like I had him projected for 5 fantasy points, 5.4. So it's kind of hard for me to go there. But I think that if you were punting at tight end, taking a lower owned one made more sense. Taking Logan Thomas, who is like the de facto tight end for Washington and only 2.45% ownership, like, yeah, I'll take that. I think that's okay. But again, like I'm not going to be wanting to punt my tight end very often at all. So, all right. So let's break down this slate a little bit farther. We've been over my lineups. We talked about the things that I wanted to do. Let's actually go into the projections first, and let's kind of talk through who I had projected well and what ended up doing well and what ended up doing badly. So start with stacks. Top stack was Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Robert Tonyan. Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady actually were the top 2 overall stacks. That makes sense when you consider what both of these teams want to do a lot of the time. Green Bay is a very pass-heavy team. There's a very skinny target tree of Aaron Rodgers plus Devontae Adams plus whoever the flavor of the month is. Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, and Mike Evans are going to eat up all the targets for the most part outside of the red zone where they like to pass to the tight end. So those 2 being top overall projected made a lot of sense. And then followed by Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, and Marquise Brown. For sure. Yeah, I mean, Lamar Jackson is always going to project as the best quarterback because of his rushing ability. Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown are going to project well, mostly because Baltimore ended up having a 28.25 implied total. Going down the list a little bit farther, Matthew Stafford, Kenny Golladay, TJ Hawkinson. Again, they were a popular stack, and I think that it made sense. But I really didn't want to stack them considering they like to let off the gas in the second half, and that's exactly what happened. They went to a very rush-heavy game plan. Kirk Cousins, Adam Thielen, and Justin Jefferson. People fucking got there in the fourth quarter because, of course, they did. I faded this game mostly because I think that the Vikings just want to pass or they want to run the ball in the end zone. So I ended up having 100% Alexander Madison, which would have done very, very well against a field that ended up having about 25% Viking stacks. I would have happily taken all of the production that Alexander Madison could have brought, but it is what it is. Matt Ryan is right here. This was actually a game stack, and both of these teams are projected pretty well. Both have a 20+ percentage of 47. Both have an overall projection of 57. Obviously, this stack was much cheaper than the Matt Ryan, Calvin Ridley, and Julio Jones stack. Well, not much cheaper, I guess, but a bit cheaper. So more people were on the Minnesota side, but Atlanta was great leverage, and I talked about that in the Discord. Cam Newton, Julian Edelman, and N'Keal Harry rated as the best value on the slate. They didn't score any touchdowns. It is what it is. And then Ryan Tannehill, A.J. Brown, and Jonnu Smith. I'm actually surprised that these 2 stacks didn't project better. I'm surprised that Houston didn't project super well, but I did very much like Houston. And Houston was about as low as I wanted to go. I did talk about Jacksonville a little bit with Minshew, Chark, and Laviska Shenault. I preferred Keelan Cole, actually, but I did talk about that stack as being better leverage off of the Detroit stack, because if Detroit was going to actually pass and find their ceilings in the second half, it would have had to be trailing and chasing Jacksonville into the second half. So I figured that if the Detroit chalk was going to pay off, it was only because Jacksonville ended up putting up a whole bunch of points in the first half, which I thought would come through the passing game. So that obviously didn't work out, but like that was my thoughts behind it. Really quick before I get into the ranges, I'm going to turn on light because I always forget to do that and I stream at night. So one sec. All right, we back. Line stack looks good going forward. Feel like all three do Jones's washed limited usage tree, if not run heavy. Yeah, I mean the problem is what I just said. Like, hold on. Because I can quantify this actually. So like this is what I use to build my pass splits. This is like the actual like model that I use. I have all the 2019 play data here, and I use that to develop pass splits based on adjusted rates. So here I'm only measuring the first and second quarter. If you look at, what is it, Detroit? Yeah, Detroit. So they passed 62.86% of the time in the first half between the 20s, right? And that was not including week one. So we'll include week one. 64.44% of the time in the first half. If you go into the second half, though, Detroit is similar in week one. Oh, they actually passed more in the second half. That's interesting because the usually what it looks like is they end up not passing at all in the second half. I wonder what that is. That's pretty interesting. They dropped down significantly weeks 3 through 5. Oh, yeah. So there it is. That makes sense. All right. So in week 1 and 2, they ended up passing a whole lot in the second half. So like you can say here, right? So Detroit is, in the first 2 weeks, they ended up passing 70% of the time in the second half. But then when you put this into the most recent weeks, they end up passing significantly less. And then in weeks 4 and 5, they drop down to only 54%. So you can see that they kind of drop down quite a bit in the second half. Like they start passing significantly less in the second half. Weeks 1 and 2, they passed more, but in weeks 3 through 5, they started passing less and less and less. And that's kind of my problem with Detroit, is they let off the gas in the second half. Like they don't really want to play in an aggressive play style in the second half, and that really, really limits their ceiling. So Detroit, as a stack, it's not really about stacking Detroit. It's more about taking their opponent and hoping that Detroit has to play from behind, and then just taking Kenny Galladay or TJ Hawkinson or Marvin Jones or like one of those pass catchers, and hoping that their opponent puts up enough points to where they actually have to chase from behind. Would you be able to put overall 5x to see what it would show, or does that take a while to send out? Oh, dude, it takes, I have to rewrite all the code. Like, I'm doing you a huge favor by rewriting that code. How do you decide for the second wide receiver 2 slot if it's a wide receiver or TE? It's actually based on, it's usually based on target share, like market share of the targets on the team, and I think PPR points? I don't remember. I have to break out my model that breaks down like how that gets broken out. But like Robert Tonyan ended up being the most valuable secondary wide receiver in that model for Aaron Rodgers. Somebody like Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is actually more valuable on DraftKings for Lamar Jackson, whereas Marquise Brown is more valuable on FanDuel, I think. Like, there's a couple that switch back and forth. Or maybe it's Jonnu Smith is more valuable to Ryan Tannehill on FanDuel, and AJ Brown is more valuable on DraftKings. But it is broken down by a different model that I run after I run the range of outcomes, and it uses the range of outcomes variables to predict who the secondary wide receiver is going to be. So it's kind of convoluted, but it works, I promise. So anyway, let us jump into the overall ranges and continue to break things down. So in terms of quarterbacks, had Lamar Jackson as the top overall projected quarterback. That made sense. Oh no, this is overall ranges. Let's go to QB. Have Lamar Jackson top overall, then Aaron Rodgers, Cam Newton, Matthew Stafford, Tom Brady, and Deshaun Watson. And these were kind of the guys, like when I talked about this slate objectively in the Discord, these were kind of the guys that separated themselves from the rest. After that, you kind of had this group that was scored above 20, and then you have a bunch of guys that were probably mediocre, and then you had guys that sucked. And most of these kind of held true. The only one I think that ended up doing significantly better in their projection was Philip Rivers. Carson Wentz ended up doing okay. But for the most part, like these ranks and these projections kind of make sense in terms of the quarterbacks that ended up doing very well and the quarterbacks that ended up doing very badly. One of the biggest misses was Ryan Tannehill, who ended up being relatively popular and ended up doing pretty damn well. Ended up being the game stack winner. Matthew Stafford was somebody who I was off of. Cam Newton ended up scoring no touchdowns, but did still score 20 fantasy points, which it just shows his floor and his ceiling. Like Lamar Jackson and Cam Newton can score no touchdowns or one touchdown and still score 20 to 25 fantasy points, whereas other quarterbacks need to throw for 3 to 4 touchdowns in order to find even their median expectation. It's why Lamar Jackson and Cam Newton are always viable in GPPs, even if it's hard to stack somebody with them. Like that's why you're going to win GPPs with them, because people don't want to use them because it's too hard to find somebody to stack them with. But they have viable options. Matthew Stafford ended up doing pretty bad, not 25 fantasy points. Deshaun Watson ended up crushing. Happy to have him up here in this kind of more elite range. Matt Ryan ended up doing very, very well. Kirk Cousins ended up doing well in the fourth quarter. I think he scored 20 fantasy points in the fourth quarter alone. And it's actually the second week where I've gotten fucked by a popular quarterback going off in the fourth quarter with Dak Prescott. Basically cost me $50,000 in week 3. So that's always a bummer. But Ryan Fitzpatrick scored pretty well. I'm okay with these projections. I think that these worked out pretty well. Let's talk about running back. So everybody sucked except for Derrick Henry, right? Like everybody sucked except for Derrick Henry. Mike Davis ended up putting up 12 fantasy points. I think Aaron Jones had under 15. Derrick Henry had 40. Alexander Madison had 4. Or 6 or something. Kareem Hunt ended up doing pretty badly. Jonathan Taylor ended up doing pretty badly. Ronald Jones ended up doing pretty well. I think he had 30 fantasy points maybe. Myles Gaskin, 16. James Robinson had an okay day. David Montgomery was bad, but I was talking about fading David Montgomery all week. James Conner ended up doing pretty well. I think he had 2 touchdowns. Joe Mixon got vultured twice. Miles Sanders got injured. And Philip Lindsay put up basically his projection. So when you're looking through those things, I think the biggest quote-unquote miss is DeAndre Swift, who I had projected for 12.9. I didn't buy into DeAndre Swift taking all of the work from Adrian Peterson, so I wasn't going to play him. Like he's still backup tight end or backup running back in my mind. When I rerun numbers, we'll see where he sits, but I wasn't going to play him this week, especially when I had Philip Lindsay at 4,300, and I had Devontae Freeman at 4,900, who was another running back that I liked in the cheap. There was just no reason for me to use DeAndre Swift. For wide receivers, Devontae Adams ended up doing really badly. There was just no passing attack for the Packers. Godwin ended up doing not so great. Adam Thielen did very well. Calvin Ridley did pretty well. Kenny Galladay did not great. Juju Smith-Schuster sucks. Devontae Parker, I don't remember how well Devontae Parker did, but I don't think that he did super well. Will Fuller ended up doing his job. AJ Brown did his job. Jameson Crowder only 11 fantasy points. Robbie Anderson only 11 fantasy points. Marquise Brown 9 fantasy points. So you can see like these guys who are all in this like 6K range, and I talked about this range a lot throughout the week. Like all of these guys were basically projected for the same. Like anybody from basically here to here was the exact same play. There was nothing that was going to tell me that I should absolutely play Will Fuller over Marquise Brown, over DJ Chark, over OBJ. Like you get my point. Like all these wide receivers in a 6K, this 5,500 to 6,500 range, were essentially the same play. Chase Claypool ended up having an okay day, as pretty chalky. He did not get the touchdowns, but he ended up having an okay day. Julio Jones is somebody who I missed on badly, very, very badly. And people were pretty into him as an Atlanta piece that was really necessary to winning the slate. Ended up putting up like 40 fantasy points. It was just one of those things where people saw that Julio Jones was less than 7K and they wanted a piece of him. But both him and Justin Jefferson ended up doing very well. I had them both projected very badly, and it is what it is. Like I tell most people when I'm talking about wide receivers, they're part of your stack. Like if you stacked Atlanta, then yeah, you have Julio Jones and you have Calvin Ridley. If you stacked Minnesota, yeah, you have Adam Thielen and you have Justin Jefferson. Like you didn't need to look at the projections to know that you need to stack those guys. And that's kind of why I say projections really only matter for running backs. And even then, like it's not like do or die. Projections are simply median expectations. And it's just one of those things where median expectations aren't necessarily going to win you the slate at any given point, especially not for wide receivers. Wide receivers, you really need to be correlating your lineups with them, and using them as one-offs is not something that is going to be making you a whole bunch of money. So wide receivers, okay, but for the most part, we're talking about stacks here. And then tight end. Mark Andrews ended up doing not great. I think Baltimore as a whole didn't do super well outside of Lamar Jackson. Jonnu Smith got injured. TJ Hawkinson didn't do anything. Mike Gesicki had 0 fantasy points, and there were hardly any passing touchdowns for Green Bay. And then all of the cheap tight ends ended up crushing. He had 20 fantasy points. He had like 12, I think. Fells had 20. First Gear had 20. Like it was a really weird week for tight ends. So was not super pumped about any of that, but like it is what it is. So I think the projections were okay for the most part. That there were things that I was on that ended up doing very well. Like I talked about Atlanta stacks, talked about Houston stacks. I talked about Lamar Jackson, even though his options did not get there. It just, it is what it is. Click 4X, you think that he's first name on that column? Yeah, he is. But like I said, I didn't care about that. I cared about not having those cheap tight ends. Like I knew that everybody wanted to have cheap tight ends. So I also knew that I wanted to not have cheap tight ends. That was going to be one way that I would leverage the field this week. So then we're going to go into results database. We are going to talk a little bit about, hold on. Did Yandy Diaz do good things? Well, he got points, so that's nice. So anyway, now we are going to talk a little bit about the results from the slate. So results database is something that I use to review the slate every week. I like to go in and like to look at ownerships across different slates. I like to look at the way that professional players are playing. I like to look at a lot of that different stuff. So this is the ownership across each different contest. And you can obviously remove different contests. So you remove the slant, luxury box, and the giant double up. And then you can see who was the highest ownership in each of the different contests. Like in the Wildcat, who is the highest owned player? It was the Dolphins defense, which is hilarious because it ended up paying off really, really well. The second highest owned was Mike Davis, who was significantly higher owned than anybody, well, significantly higher than in the Millie Maker and in the $3. Same with David Montgomery, who was higher owned than both of those as well. Pretty even ownership for Thielen, Galladay, Gaskins, and Derrick Henry. You can keep moving down a little bit, and you can kind of see, like, if you sort by highest here, you see that Chase Claypool ended up being a really, really popular play in the $3 and in the 20, but not in the Wildcat. You can see that, let's see, who was the biggest discrepancy for the $3? Looks like $3 and the Millie Maker were pretty close in terms of overall ownership. Like Claypool was way higher than $3, super, super high in $3. So Mike Davis looked like, again, like if you're in the Wildcat and you're playing a 333 lineup, like you know what you're doing. And Mike Davis was 10% higher owned in that contest than these ones, because people knew that he was basically the same play as Derrick Henry. So, you know, these are the ownerships across each slate. I think that most of them mostly make sense. There's a little bit condensed ownership in the 333 on the better plays, of course. Devontae Adams was higher owned in that contest as well. Somebody like Jonathan Taylor was higher owned in that contest by a good margin. So this is worth looking at to kind of make sure that your process was right with the people who have more money on the slate than you do. When you're going through these entries, like I broke this down into each of one of these three contests. So this is the Millie Maker, this is the Wildcat, and I'll move this over so that it's kind of in the same way. First place in the 333s, or in the $3 in the play action, scored 261.5 points. He ended up having 20 entries. This one had a Houston stack with three Houston players: Deshaun Watson, Brandon Cooks, Darren Fells, and Will Fuller. Brought back with A.J. Brown and Derrick Henry. Also had DeAndre Swift with Justin Jefferson and a Steelers defense. And if you click on that player, you can go in and you can see what their actual ownerships were. So we'll do that now. This B-Train person. So it looks like they capped ownership at 40%, but they did end up having 40% Derrick Henry, 40% or 35% A.J. Brown, 30% Justin Jefferson. Like he was over the field on all of these players. If he was under the field on anybody, let's see, he was under the field on Chase Claypool. He was under the field on Myles Gaskin. He was under the field on Kenny Galladay. Under the field on Mike Davis. Like those were all really important fades for him to have. Chase Claypool ended up with 18 fantasy points, but that's not near what the field would expect from him in the $3. So being able to be away on those guys and having his highest ownerships, like 43 fantasy points, 42 fantasy points, 21 fantasy points, 22, like made him the money on that. If you move over into the Millie Maker, Wacky Uncle ended up taking it down with an Atlanta stack. He ended up having Matt Ryan with Julio Jones and Hayden Hurst. Brought it back with Justin Jefferson. Had Derrick Henry, Ronald Jones, and DeAndre Swift as running backs. Also had Justin Jefferson and Marquise Valdes-Scantling as a one-off there. Montgomery has great usage. Are you kidding? He does not have great usage. You're a liar. He does not have great usage. I talked about this in the week 6 recipe for success. Like the dude averages under 10 rushing attempts per game, and like he averages. It's not like an Alvin Kamara situation where Alvin Kamara can have 10 rushes and 10 targets and end up with 30 fantasy points. Like that's not what David Montgomery is going to do. Like that's his usage is not what it needs to be. This stack makes sense. Like he won this GPP. He won the Millie Maker with Marquise Valdes-Scantling here at 4,600. Like there are other plays that he could have had that would have skyrocketed him. But he only had one entry. Like he did it with a single entry. If you look at Hogzilla here, who had 151, like let's go look at his ownerships really quick. He less than 10 rushing attempts, and they like to pass in the red zone. Like if you go and look at the opportunity search tool, which I showed off with David Montgomery, like this is not incredible usage. This is not incredible usage. Ends up with 10 rushing attempts, 8 carries. This is supposed to be 6. I don't know why this says 3. Like he averages about 1 fantasy point per touch. Like if with this usage, with less than 20 touches, he would have to average at least like 1.5 fantasy points per touch in order to be a viable play each week in, week out. And he doesn't. Like, he's not effective. He's not efficient. He doesn't get that much usage. He's a bad play week in, week out. I hate to break it to you because you usually hit on some pretty good plays, but like, not him. David Montgomery, he's not that great. Like, maybe from week 6 he was better, but like last week going into week 6, big ol' nope. Let's take a look at Hogzilla's ownership here. He ended up doing pretty well. I think he placed third. He had 150 lineups. Let's sort by most down. So he ended up with 32.67% of both Devontae Adams and Kenny Golladay. And that makes a lot of sense. Devontae Adams had the highest projection for me in the projections overall. Kenny Golladay, I think, was top 5. Yeah, he was top 5. Adam Thielen was top as well, actually. Yeah, so like Kenny Golladay is right there. Devontae Adams is right there. Adam Thielen is right there. Dolphins defense, he had 30%, I guess. I didn't have James Robinson all that high rated, but Mark Andrews was the top overall tight end projection. Like, these things make sense. Irv Smith, he ended up with 20%, which is high for me. But like, he was a value. Like, he made things work. So I think that for the most part makes sense. If you look at just his quarterbacks, you can see where he spread out his exposures to. So he ended up with 20% Ryan Fitzpatrick, 20% Matthew Stafford, 15% Kirk Cousins, 12% Sean Watson. The lineup that ended up doing very well for him was the Kirk Cousins one, which was with, let's see, Kirk Cousins, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Julio Jones, Kenny Golladay, Justin Jefferson, Anthony Firkser, DeAndre Swift, and the Patriots defense. So like, he was basically one good play away here. He was basically, James Robinson instead of Jonathan Taylor from shipping this, I think. And he had a lot of James Robinson, too. In terms of running backs. Oh, no, he only scored 15. So who would he have needed? He would have needed Ronald Jones. Yeah. And he had 15% Ronald Jones. So just that one change there would have had him $1 million on this lineup. And that's kind of one of those things where like it is what it is in the coin flips of MME. Like, he had all the exposures that he needed. He had exposures to the players that he needed. It just didn't come together in the right lineup. And that sucks. But like, this is a really good lineup. And you can look at his ownerships and you can see like it was pretty obvious what he was on, you know? Like, you take it away and he's like, all right, I'm gonna go with Dolphins. Like, he's going to spread out his stacks quite a bit. The ones he had the most of were Houston, Minnesota, Detroit, and the Dolphins. For running backs, he ended up capping at 30% and then spreading out a lot. Like, he had a lot of different running backs involved. For wide receivers, he had a lot of different wide receivers involved, but not as much as running backs. And he actually had quite a bit more ownership to his top 3 wide receivers. And that comes from stacks, obviously. Tight end, he ended up having a really, really small pool. He basically said, I want Mark Andrews, I want Irv Smith Jr., I want Mike Gesicki, and I want Johnny Smith. And then like, I'm going to kind of spread it out to the rest of them. He only had 2% Anthony Firkser. And that was basically just saying, hey, I want a little bit just in case Johnny Smith ends up like not doing anything. And Anthony Firkser ended up in one of those. So 2% of his lineups could have possibly had this. How much DeAndre Swift did he have? He had a pretty low amount of DeAndre Swift, huh? Or did I miss him up top? Oh, Swift. Yeah, he only had 2%. So there were 2% of lineups that ended up having DeAndre Swift and 2% of lineups that ended up having Anthony Firkser. And one of those ended up in third place in the Maker. So, like, if that doesn't tell you about the volatility of MME, like, I don't know what to tell you. So I think that'll probably be pretty good for wrapping things up today. It was a pretty wild slate. There were a lot of extreme values that happened, extreme highs and extreme lows. So I think that moving forward, like a lot of people are kind of going to be a little bit more risk averse, I think, and people are probably going to end up on more chalk. People are going to try to end up more on Derrick Henry probably because of the 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. But it was a week of extreme outcomes, and I think that this was not a week where you're going to be looking at your process and thinking that you did anything necessarily wrong. There are a lot of things that could have gone right, a lot of things that could have gone wrong. And if you ended up on things that went right, I don't think that your process was any better than somebody who might have ended up on a couple of things that went wrong. The process is more important than the results here. How does 20 max have a higher score than 150 max? Because there are more lineups. So like in the $3, it's a lot more lineups than in the Millie Maker. I didn't play him. I just think going forward the TD should be there. Hold on. I can measure that. So for rushing touchdowns, David Montgomery. Yeah, man. I wouldn't say so. 3 rushing attempts inside the 20 in the first couple weeks. In terms of receiving touchdowns. Oh, I don't have running backs involved in this, but yeah, it's just not. Dave Montgomery's not my cup of tea. How much do you factor in awful QB play like Mayfield to individual talent situation like Hunt? I don't really care too much about that. Like if a team is implied to score a couple touchdowns, like I think that Vegas is better at assessing talent than I am. That's why I don't usually worry that much about talent. Like when you look at Vegas info, and they're going to tell you how many points they think that a team is going to score. And that's going to take into account a lot of the talent things that people talk about. Cleveland was only projected for 23.75 points. However, because of the way they split up their touchdowns, they were still a top 5 team in terms of expected rushing touchdowns. Like they were still projected for 1.67 rushing touchdowns, just not a lot of passing touchdowns. So I think that it's easy to look at a team total of like 20 to 24 and be like, oh, that team sucks. But it's really, really important to know where those touchdowns are most likely to come from. Kareem Hunt, should he end up getting, the vast majority of the rushing touchdown work, which he should, like if you look in here, like Kareem Hunt ends up with quite a few rushes inside the 20, projected for 0.94 touchdowns here. That's still a pretty good play, in my opinion. And it's one of those things where, like, yeah, Derrick Henry's projected to score a lot of touchdowns. Dalvin Cook / Alexander Madison projected to score a lot of touchdowns. Todd Gurley, Kareem Hunt. Like, I can quantify these things, and that's more important to me, I think, than looking at projections or looking at individual player skill, because I think that Vegas does a much better job of breaking those kind of things down than I will. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I had some issues. My camera died yesterday. And I appreciate you guys coming back in and tuning in and listening to me talk about the slate a little bit. If you don't already have a subscription to pater.ghost.io, go get a subscription. I always appreciate that. We're having a fun NFL season. And if you guys don't have a subscription here, you can always do that as well. I'm going to get out of here and go eat some dinner, but I'll answer any more questions in the Discord as well. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm going to jump out of here, but I'll talk to you guys again later on this week.